In this lesson, we will be creating our project in Supabase, which will let us set up authentication. And in a future chapter, will let us set up a database that we can start to store data in. We're going to be setting up our Supabase authentication with a GitHub OAuth provider. So we'll be in Supabase and GitHub for this lesson. So let's get started. First, you'll want to come up to the top here and sign in. I'm already signed in with my GitHub account. And from there, you're going to create a new project. And then choose a name that you like. For right now, we don't need to worry about what the database password is. And Supabase makes it pretty easy to change the password later on if you forget it or misplace it or something like that. So for now, we're just going to hit generate password so we have something. And again, we don't need the database password yet, so I'm not even going to bother with copying it and saving it somewhere. Supabase takes a few minutes to spin up our database as we need the database in order to use the authentication. But since we have our API keys here, we can actually get started setting up our GitHub OAuth provider. So we'll come over to the side here, and you can see that we have a whole bunch of different options here. We've got the table editor, the SQL editor, and those are just nice UIs that we can use to access our database. Then we have the database, authentication, storage, and edge functions. Those are the four main products that Supabase offers us. In this course, we will only be looking at the database and authentication. So we can see now that our project has spun up. So let's go into the authentication tab. Then we're going to click under providers. And here we have all of the different authentication providers that we can use with Supabase. By default, Supabase will just use email-based authentication. This means that Supabase will be keeping track of the passwords and usernames for your users in your database that we just spun up. But that's a little bit more complicated and requires everyone to create yet another account. So instead, we're just going to use the GitHub provider. This lets us reuse everyone's existing GitHub account. Just as you logged into Supabase with your GitHub account, we can log into our online course platform with the GitHub account that we already have. So we first enable this, and then we need to copy the redirect URL. We need this redirect URL when we set up our GitHub OAuth app. So now we need to go into GitHub. And what we need to do is create an OAuth app. And this app is what Supabase will communicate with. We'll go up to the top here, go down into settings, then scroll all the way down here to developer settings. We'll create a new GitHub app. And I just need to do some two-factor authentication. You may need to do some two-factor authentication like I do here. So I will just hit this and put in my code. We'll use the same name that we were before with our Supabase app, or our Supabase project, sorry. For the homepage URL, we'll use the base of the URL that we copied from our Supabase. And then in here, we need to use the callback URL. We'll paste that in, ending with auth/v1/callback. And then we need to come down here and we actually need to uncheck this webhook We don't need any permissions to actually access the GitHub user here. If we wanted to, we could add that in. If we needed to check out code or put in commits or approve PRs, things like that. However, since we're only using the GitHub OAuth system in order to authenticate our users, we can skip this part entirely. Next, we'll need to generate a client secret so that we can properly authenticate between the apps. Now we want to copy this secret and go back to our Supabase setup. And here where it says client secret, we're going to paste that in. We also need to update the client ID here with the ID that GitHub has given us. Then we hit save, and we should be good to go. Now we have GitHub and Supabase successfully linked together so that when we use Supabase for authentication, we can actually use GitHub as an OAuth provider so that we can use GitHub accounts in order to authenticate our users without having to deal with managing accounts ourselves. In order to actually use Supabase within our app, though, we will be using the Nuxt Supabase module. This uses the Supabase JavaScript SDK, but then wraps it in reactive composables and gives support for SSR. So we'll come back to our project here. We will open up a new terminal and install the Supabase Nuxt.js module. Now, as we've seen with the view use module that we added before, once we've installed it, we now need to add it to the Nuxt config. Once we save, our app reloads and we can see that we get an error. The Supabase URL is required. So there's some further setup that we need to do in order to get our Supabase module to actually connect with our Supabase project. We will tackle that in the next lesson, where we'll look at environment variables and how we can use them in our Nuxt app.